Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the third annual PRCA Health Conference. We're excited to bring it to you this year in a slightly different format. So we've got 3 days of, kind of lunchtime sessions. We actually have a last minute change. So day 2, which was happening tomorrow, is actually going to be next week due to our a couple speaker availabilities. But we've got today and Thursday, and then the session next week where we're going to be chatting through emerging digital and social platforms. We have over 500 million people who joined social media during the pandemic. I know I was one of those people who started consuming things on TikTok. So plenty to discuss in today's session, I'm sure. We're going to be looking at policy changes and what the last 18 months has meant for policy within the healthcare landscape. And we're also going to be chatting through new business and emerging kind of business opportunities that really weren't a thing for the healthcare sector, kind of 18 to 24 months ago, and really what that looks like. We're trying to keep this very forward-looking and future-facing, just because I think we're all ready for that now. As we kind of emerge in this post-pandemic landscape, what does that really mean for all of us working in healthcare comms, and what are the opportunities for us to really be part of that change, rather than just watching it go by. So we're really excited to have you with us today. We will be recording all the sessions, and they will be available afterwards. So if you have to duck out, or if you have kind of colleagues who would like to see it later, they will be able to do so. If you'd like to tweet along with us on the day, we are using hashtag PRCA Health Conf, CONF, and that's the hashtag that we've been using every year. So please do tweet, and we will make sure to amplify and retweet. And yeah, a big thank you to Vuelio, our key sponsors for the PRCA Health Group as well. I will leave it there. We've got an action-packed agenda for today, and I'm going to hand to Rosie, who is chairing this great session.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ishtar. So welcome, everybody, to today's session, which is entitled The New Digital Frontiers, Identifying and Leveraging Emerging Social Platforms. So in preparation for today's event, I was challenging myself to come up with a sentence or metaphor which really articulated the evolution and impact that social media and social platforms have had on our world over the last 10 years. And I have to say, I couldn't come up with anything that I felt did it justice. So that is my challenge to everybody today. But thinking about the impact in terms of not only the number of people who can now access these channels, as Ishtar said, 500 million people joined social media last year, but also as well its centricity to our lives. And obviously that impact has been vastly accelerated through living in an environment over the last 18 months where our physical worlds have become so much more restricted that it feels very natural that people would turn to the virtual ones so much more, which has really increased the innovation that has happened. So today's session, as Ishtar said, we are really excited to be really looking at the future. But I think in order to do so, we need to really establish how the last 18 months have changed our relationship with social media, and then the path that will mean that we take. Thinking about the healthcare industry particularly, but also thinking about the fact that our patients and HCPs are not, of course, just HCPs and patients, they are people as well. So their virtual worlds are much greater than the immediate medical areas that impact them. So we will be focusing on this. We will then be looking at the innovation and evolution and in the social industry, and how we as practitioners can keep up with that. So I am really delighted to be joined by today's panel. We have Corin Baird of HAVAS Just, we have Tom Deacon of Pulsar, and we have Charlotte Turner of Ogilvy Health. I have a series of questions which I'm going to put to our panel over the next hour, and then we will be turning to a Q&A from all of you. So please, when the time comes, submit your questions in the chat. But before we dive into the questions, I will invite our panelists to introduce themselves. So Corin, let's start with you, please.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Corin. I'm head of digital here at HAVAS. Just many moons ago, I have a medical background, but then got into digital and the consumer side. So spent rather too many years to mention in digital for consumer, and then ranging from production to creative, many different publishers like The Guardian and also BuzzFeed. And then I got back into the medical agency side, where one of my previous agencies wanted to BuzzFeedify medical digital content to make it a little bit more exciting. So I've sort of really embraced that now. And lovely to see you all. Hi.
Fantastic. Thank you, Corin. And Tom, over to you.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm Tom Deacon. I'm an enterprise solutions consultant here at Pulsar, and essentially what that means is I help companies to structure social data around their business objectives. And I've been working for quite a number of years now with pharma clients on our side, and watched how the conversation in the pharmaceutical and digital space has developed, and how studying particularly, influence networks and communities of people online and how they engage with particular content.
Thank you, Tom. And Charlotte.
Thanks, Rosie. Hello, everyone. I am Charlotte Turner, and I am a social media director here at Ogilvy Health. And I have always worked my whole career in healthcare communications, and testament to the longevity of social. Social has always loomed at some point on that spectrum of comms. But outside of professional life, I am also just a massive social media fan and junkie, and a true advocate for the various platforms. So it's not just professionally that I love social.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. So my first question is admittedly a rather broad one, but what I really wanted to do was set the scene of where we are at the moment in terms of how the consumers around us interact with social media. So my first question, which Charlotte, as a self-confessed social junkie, I would love to get your thoughts on, is what do you think the key shifts are that we've seen in social channel usage over the last 18 months, both in healthcare, but also more broadly? And how has the pandemic, if it has, in your opinion, impacted on these?
Thanks, Rosie. Well, I think it's really, as you were saying at the start, last year, the past 18 months, kind of shut down other ways to connect, and digital and social channels provided an alternative for that connection. I mean, you referenced the fact that we obviously have seen a massive grow in terms of social media users. I think it's now 4.2 billion people around the world are social media users, which is quite staggering. But in terms of healthcare specifically, there's even a kind of growth in this area. And I think LinkedIn now has over 7 million healthcare professional registered accounts on their platform. It's just growing year on year, and people are finding new and innovative ways to connect. And I think that's key to it in terms of what's driving it. It is allowing people to connect in new and different ways, considering all of our in-face connections got shut off for a period of time last year. Yeah, that was, I think, kind of key to what's happened, and it in terms of just sheer growth.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, the growth piece, I think, is staggering. And when you keep in mind the stats we referenced at the start with people joining social media channels for the first time, rather than just increasing the number of social channels they're on, it really does speak to that need for that connected world. Corin, I would love to hear from you on what you think the key shifts that we've seen are in terms of online behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, as well as that, we've now got a much more generation who are digitally native, who are also healthcare professionals. So they've also seen that they can be content creators and are able to get out and in front of patients and give them information, or just, the public, especially over the pandemic. So be able to get things out in a slightly more interesting way than just leaving a leaflet in a doctor's surgery. They've really embraced themselves getting in front of their webcams or whatever, and creating content in a way that is approachable and dare I say snackable, but it's something that's easily digested. So to have the totally open way in which they're embracing it to get this information out, as well as consuming stuff, is great. And also I think that there's been, especially in the last 18 months, obviously with there's a lot of information, misinformation that's there to be able to right wrongs and to actually have a voice to say, actually, this is the truth, and really get involved on that as well has been massive. Whereas I don't think the healthcare professional sort of community has been quite so vocal about things like that before. So that's enormous for content creation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Corin. I know Tom has lots to say on the subject of misinformation, so I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. But building on what you referenced around this generation of digital natives that we have now, who are so much more comfortable with exploring new ways of sharing information and that innovative snackable content. Are there any examples of formats that you think have really kind of grabbed people's attention, or any platforms that they've been particularly successful on?
YouTube is obviously the most enormous video search engine, but I mean the thing for me is talking to people at TikTok and just looking at some of their TikTok's been an enormous content creation piece over the last 18 months. And to see how many pieces of content that has been done from nurses and doctors and people on there for not only from COVID, but also from mental health as well. Alex from Big Brother, the doctor, he's also on GMTV, where he gets everywhere, but he's been doing so much stuff for mental health through the pandemic as well, so, and through TikTok, through as many platforms as he can get on, really. But there's been so many amazing ways. But yeah, I mean, these emerging platforms, like you say, like TikTok has been great because because they're only small pieces of video, people feel confident about dipping their toe in, as opposed to sitting down and having to do something a bit more produced. So I think that's been, you know, a real trailblazer to get people really creating the content and getting in front of others.
And Tom, as I mentioned, you have done huge amounts of work looking into the way that the pandemic has given people opportunities to present information, which is, let's say, questionable, and put it politely. I would love to hear your thoughts on that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, prior to the pandemic, there was quite an interesting phenomenon which was taking place online. And it's that for the most part, people were engaging in communities that had some kind of political alignment with themselves. So like a very strong concept of left and right wing existed online. And these were, broadly speaking, bringing in more and more people into them as you know, very politicizing events were taking place, like Brexit or Trump's presidency, stuff like that. What seemed to happen during the pandemic was there was a huge influx of people onto the social networks. And what that seemed to do was break down those existing, I suppose, echo chambers or existing communities of people which were based on politics and start to broaden out the interests which they were engaging in. But one of the unfortunate realities that takes place is that people who exist on either extreme kind of become more isolated and become more consolidated in their network. And the reason why I suppose this is relevant, especially in relation to this misinformation stuff, is that within those polar extremes, you get the birth of key narratives that take hold in the public perception. So, you know, an example from a few years ago would be the anti-vax narrative, which has obviously now developed into the anti-COVID vaccine narrative, but we're just going back to the MMR jab stuff. What they'll do is they'll have an incredibly cohesive, you know, strong network of people whom are very open to sharing content with one another because they see it conferring some level of legitimacy upon themselves to share content around the dangers of vaccine because it fits in with perceived knowledge that they have. And what they have within those communities are so-called experts or doctors who are legitimate MDs or trained professionals who can verify what they're saying. And they can also find shreds of evidence within authoritative places. So a court case around, you know, a vaccine injury or something like that, which can then provide evidence for the narrative they're trying to push, you know, however, you know, soft or not particularly compelling that evidence is, the fact that it fits in with that narrative is enough. So, you know, the reason why, you know, I kind of make this point is because within those extremities, these narratives develop, and as a pharmaceutical company or as a healthcare comms or digital professional, you know, keeping an eye on those narratives as they develop and broaden out from the extremities into the mainstream is an important key element of trying to combat this misinformation. The misinformation doesn't come from the center of the network, or at the center of people in the spectrum. It comes from these extreme positions wherein there's already a huge amount of distrust in the nature of pharmaceutical companies and what pharmaceutical companies are trying to achieve, whether that's just healthcare for the masses or preventative drugs or whatever it might be.
And I would love to know, as someone who is forever fascinated by the mechanics of analytics work, but by absolute no means a specialist in it myself, when you talk about tracking that conversation and being able to look at those trends and assessing whether the conversation is broadening and the I guess direction of travel it's going in, how does that practically work, and how is that information best conveyed? Again, thinking about the guidance which we as practitioners, I think we have a lot of agency people on the line, give to our clients.
Sure. I mean, one of the difficulties is obviously a lot of these networks are quite closed off. So we can obviously analyze them, we can understand them, but it's measuring their impact really, which is the key thing, because they can say whatever they want between 15 people, but it only matters once that reaches out and starts grabbing other people. So it's maybe a very basic way of doing it, but actually, if you are aware of these narratives, when you hear them in public, in person, that's always a very good indication that they started breaking out. The other way of doing it is using simple metrics on social, from what these people are talking about around impressions or around visibility online, to see if it has broken free of the constraints of its network and is now being proliferated in the broader community and in the broader view of the public.
Thank you. And Charlotte, I know you've done a lot of work on Twitter in the past. Have you seen, which I think it's probably fair to say is the home of a lot of this misinformation in terms of the well-known social channels. Is that something that you have seen affect the work you've done, or do you anticipate it potentially affecting the work that you're doing?
I think it definitely has changed in the past 18 months. I mean, it was noticeable when Twitter silently removed their ads transparency center. Noticeable to people in the industry, at least, that would seem to be a step back from accountability. But one of my favorite features from the past 18 months that Twitter instigated was the do you really want to share that article that you haven't read button that came up, which I think we all know someone who blindly reads a headline and just sends it on without thinking because it's all clickbait driven. I think that it showed some thinking, at least from Twitter, that they were trying to tackle something. And I mean, there's been reports of other platforms not necessarily taking the same steps. And one of the most popular shared articles being a very kind of pro-anti-vaxxer statement. So from Twitter's perspective, I definitely think you can see measures are being put in place to try and limit this echo chamber. And likewise, their move recently to introduce communities, they're trying to shift away from people being connected via these slightly sketchy, polarized political links and actually reconnect on things that are much more positive. So communities built around football, which in itself can be problematic, as we saw from the World Cup. So it's always going to be difficult and there's always going to be growing and changing. But I think definitely from Twitter's perspective, they've made some steps to trying to be accountable. And I mean, the topic of accountability is quite interesting and something that brands and agencies need to take into account, because everything you share has the risk of being shared out of context. There's wonderful cases on TikTok, however, of this accountability being disseminated amongst the community and people taking on vigilante justice to hunt down people sharing misinformation. I think TikTok as a platform, as a newer platform, has a different mindset in that respect. And people are, I think, much more wise to it. They talk about being on the wrong side of TikTok, on the wrong side, on the dark side of it. And there's open discussions. It's not hidden. It's not kind of people ignoring the truth that these online platforms have a darker side or a darker potential to them. So I think TikTok could be following in the same space as Twitter, and other platforms could do well to follow suit in terms of taking more measures for accountability. And in terms of where brands can have a presence and what role they can play, that could come into play there as well.
That's great. And I loved hearing about the communities that you mentioned on Twitter and that shift from the individual to the group. Do you think that is something which we, again, thinking about the work that we deliver to our clients, do you think there's an opportunity to evolve how we interact with Twitter there? And if so, how do you think people could go about that?
I think the main shift and the main kind of mindset that could be evolved for a lot of brands, especially pharma companies who have been historically slower to adopt social and digital practices, is to just move away from a broadcast only mindset. This isn't paid media, this is social media. The hint is in the name, it's social, it's meant to be more dialogic, and you can have more fun with social. It sounds like a strange thing to throw out there in the healthcare space, but fun and entertainment is a key driver for why people are on these platforms. And you're going to have more success if you meet people in the mindset that they're in, rather than trying to force your mindset on them. I can see Corin nodding, so please jump in if you have anything else you want to contribute to that.
I totally agree with you. The other thing I think for some of the pharma companies is that they spend their time doing a campaign, and they built a group of people who they're talking to for maybe one campaign, but actually in social, you need to continue that conversation. You can't just do that for 3 months or something. If you really want to be successful, they sometimes, they pay considerable amounts of money to make it a little community, but then drop it. So I think it's actually maintaining that contact as well that's going to be successful.
Absolutely. Fantastic. So Corin, I know something which you are particularly interested in, and I think you alluded to it a little bit earlier when you talked about lots more of the healthcare community shifting to that influencer space, is how that world impacts potential telehealth as well, and how those lines blur. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit on that point, and how you think that will impact brands such as Babylon, who are offering a dedicated professional health service.
Absolutely. Fun enough, when I was sat outside waiting for this meeting room, there was I was just checking The Guardian, and they said that in Parliament, they said all of GP, they want to have all of new GP face-to-face, and they said that's just undeliverable to try and catch up. They can't do that. So I mean, just today, to have a headline like that is, they know they've got to do something to mop up all of these sort of the appointments where they can't do face-to-face, and that's going to really help with telehealth. Babylon Health has been doing that very successfully. Even, I mean, some of the company healthcare benefits, you have to have a video conversation before they'll do a referral. So, these things are picking up speed. And I also think, especially in the last however long, people haven't been able to get out. So these solutions have come up actually surprisingly quickly. Often you think with some of the bigger pharma companies, it's like trying to turn a tanker. It's going to take ages, but it's shown the last 18 months for these digital developments to have happened so quickly, and the uptake of them to have been so quick as well, and to be relied on, shows that actually we can do things and get great tech out there, as long as people adopt it. And yes, it's sort of been semi-forced adoption, but I mean, we've got it here now. So to maintain that and really use this tech that's come out to help is, I think, rather than going back to an older model, I think, we've got it here. So really maintain it.
And I guess one of the kind of challenges with that potentially is, needless to say, everybody on this call is on a Zoom, and given the industry we're in, I'm going to assume there is a pretty high level of digital literacy. But when we think about a lot of the audiences we serve, for example, I'm working on a condition at the moment where the average age is 77. Your average 77-year-old, perhaps the pandemic has changed this ever so slightly, that they probably aren't going to feel as comfortable with the concept of speaking to their GP over the phone. Do you, and please, Charlotte, Tom, question to you both as well. Do you think that there is work to be done in broadening the appeal of telehealth and how that can be done? Or do you think it is something which companies are quite comfortable sitting with the younger generations as kind of a general rule of thumb?
I think there's going to have to have some sort of triage to it initially, because some people who really probably will need the one-to-one, but I think that's going to be, there could be some sort of triage way of doing that to see who's going to adopt it. It's also going to be, who's got the right equipment at home as well, if they're going to have something like a Zoom to make sure there's something that's right for them. So probably for the older generation, it's going to be more based on a laptop and a webcam as opposed to a phone. But I mean, I think the big thing is going to be the triage piece, but I think we can see that there's more and more tech being adopted now. I mean, even looking at things like Alexa and Google Home, things like that, that's been taken on enormously by the older generation to make sure they're connected to their families. So there is this change to make sure the connection's better. I mean, I know Facebook's been doing this portal. There's a huge adverts for portal over the pandemic as well, to make sure families are connected by having that. And even seeing if, that could be pushed into GP surgeries if it is going to be adopted by families to keep them connected, are there ways that they can use these pieces of tech to incorporate that into their surgeries too?
Thank you. And Tom, how do you think the increase of HCP conversation, but also that dynamic with telehealth will impact the dynamics of patient conversations, or indeed HCP conversations as well?
Well, I think in terms of telehealth, there's, people's experiences, at least a couple of years ago, with using the internet to get healthcare advice was very much, you go on WebMD and you type in, I have knee pain, and it tells you have cancer. So they never really trusted it as an idea. It was always like, okay, this is a bit of a hypochondriac device. Whereas, now you can get, speaking to a doctor directly through a GP, you can get very clear, obvious advice and have your prescriptions prescribed to you. And I think for the most part, it will take people to experience that in person. Well, not literally in person, but, of themselves, to get over that kind of hump around whether or not they think it's a good or bad idea. I personally have done it. I think it's a very useful way of doing it, and it's much easier than having to go into a GP when you're feeling ill. In terms of how it affects kind of patient HCP conversations, I think the interesting thing is you kind of have broadly speaking, you have two different styles of conversation that take place online. And one is an audience-led conversation, the other is an influencer-led conversation. And an audience-led conversation in pharma, or in healthcare, looks like individuals who go on specialist forums to go and speak to other people suffering from their illness. So if they have psoriatic arthritis, if they have, gallbladder cancer, or whatever it might be, they can find support groups online whom they can go on and share their experiences with and discuss ideas with. It's not explicit medical advice they're getting, it's support, but it's also best practice that other people have gone through, and it's global in terms of its reach and who they're speaking to. HCPs, on the other hand, when they exist in that influencer-led conversation space. And so what we're starting to see now is a growth in HCPs who are using more algorithm or network-based social sites. And what that essentially means is that they have to either game the algorithm on something like TikTok or Instagram, or they have to be appealing to the people they're trying to reach, so on Twitter. So in many ways, the influencers are influenced by what is popular, and they're having to present existing ideas or become specialist in existing ideas. So something that's very popular at the moment is plant-based health, or plant-based foods, and the effect that has on health. A lot of doctors now, especially the online doctors, are talking about the importance of plant-based health on your gut health, and all of the additional impacts that have around mental health, around just general well-being in your stomach, around just how your body interacts with itself, essentially. So I think what's going to be interesting is that the influencers themselves are influenced by the people they're trying to influence. So they're providing content for people who want to consume it, and they're essentially having to play the demand game and provide the supply of that demand where it comes to content creation and conversational stuff. So, it's not necessarily going to be an academic-led conversation around what are the illnesses we need to look out for and what do we need to do. It's very much going to be a democratized concept of health and healthcare, and it will essentially, I think, play up to prevailing narratives within the healthcare space in terms of what's popular, and they'll continue to proliferate those ideas around popularity.
Fantastic. And when we talk about influencers, I know the definition of who constitutes an influencer has evolved hugely since the time of, well, they need to have X many number of followers and they need to be active on these channels. But within the healthcare arena, what would you say defines someone as being an influencer beyond that kind of push out of information that you touched on? How can we best identify what a really strong influencer looks like for potential involvement in a campaign?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways you can measure influence online. So one of them would be influence to a topic. So influence around the concept of food health or veganism, for example. And when you're looking at that topic, who's putting the most content out there, and where's that? How big is their reach of that content? The next step on that would be to identify how influential someone is within a more specific topic under an umbrella term. So instead of just looking at veganism, we want to look at people talking about the effect of veganism on gut health and therefore mental health. And then you look at, again, who is super influential in terms of the volume of posts, but then also the reach of those posts and the success of those posts within that very niche space. And then the final one is identifying an audience of people. So, people who self-identify as spoonies or people who self-identify as doctors, and running a behavioral data analysis on them to find out who they follow. So you're identifying influence through the dynamic of who's influential to an audience, not who's influential to a topic. So yeah, it really boiled down to those kind of three different ways of indexing influence in the online space, and depending on if you're trying to reach a topic, conversation, or a group of people.
And with that in mind, Corin, Charlotte, are there any campaigns, either healthcare or otherwise, that you can think of, or indeed have worked on yourself, because we love to shout about great work, that you think have used influencers to in a really effective or interesting way? That, quite full disclosure, everybody, that question was not in my show notes. That was one that popped into my head while Tom was speaking. So we can come back to that one if that would be helpful.
I think a big one for me was that it's actually finding people in local market. We talked to in healthcare, and I was working at a previous agency, and we had a group of KOLs who were putting together the content, but they had great impact in their community, and they had a lot of seniority, but they weren't prescribing and they weren't treating. So actually from that, we ran this campaign for a number of years, and it was taking some feedback from actually the users. They said, we want to actually hear from people who are on the ground, who are prescribing, and who are in our market. Rather than have this sort of rather out of touch group of people who, yes, are amazing and they're very well respected. A lot of the content they wanted to see and engage with was someone from on the ground in their market and who could speak their language, who was still seeing patients. So from that, the feedback, it gave us a really good kick up the behind to say, okay, we need to go out and find these people, and finding rising stars, people like that, going online, seeing who the people who are really enthusiastic, especially who have adopted these new platforms, and they then became people that we are reaching out to become influencers and content creators.
Awesome. Charlotte, over to you as well.
Thank you. I mean, the first one that came to mind was actually something that our colleagues in the US have been working on for an incredibly devastating rare lung disease. And the challenge with rare diseases is that you need to go broad to be able to reach the 1 in 1,000 people that might have this condition. And so actually, although it might not seem it straight away, it lends itself really strongly to the idea of using an influencer as a beacon to kind of attract people. And our US team have had the pleasure, although in the UK we didn't get to meet her, of working with Queen Latifah on a campaign for an incredibly rare disease. And that might sound like, oh, okay, you're throwing a big name at it. But the kind of key point I think that we'll hopefully all agree to when it comes to using an influencer is that she had an authentic connection to the condition. Her mother sadly passed away from the disease. And for her, it was really important that she could use the shared platform to make the most people aware of this condition as possible, so that they don't have to go through the same struggles. And it was cool that you get to work with an influencer. Influencer campaigns have been the trendy thing for many years now. But what I don't think will ever go away is that you have to be authentic. There has to be a reason. You can find all the stats and data, and you can see what someone looks like on paper as a really strong influencer. But coming from a PR background, maybe this is what has kind of clouded my lens. The story just has to be there. The narrative, the connection has to be there. And that was why it was so cool working with that, because you could see how much it meant to her personally, not just as a kind of another checklist of doing a campaign.
Definitely. And the responses from the community must have really reflected that as well.
It was huge. They've managed to just really turn the tide in their market. And I mean, interesting that Corin talks about kind of market suitability. Strategically, it was agreed that, you know, it doesn't always work in other markets. As much as other people have heard of Queen Latifah, Japan, not so much. That's not the place for it. So I think there is the suitability factor has to come into play as well. And it was a great campaign for the US market in particular.
Fantastic. Thank you. Awesome. So we've talked a little bit about influencers, and we're now going to talk about the channels that they work on. So Charlotte, I'm going to come to you first with this question. Obviously, TikTok has shaken the world up hugely in terms of where people are looking. And I think, you know, we've seen Instagram launching various new functionalities which show that they are feeling the need to keep up. But what do you anticipate there being any significant shifts in the popularity or usage of social channels over the next year beyond the Twitter community piece that we discussed?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I would love to talk about TikTok. I am obsessed, and I have also seen the real rapid growth. I was part of the dissenting millennials who thought it was Gen Zs, and then slowly were brought on board over the pandemic. And then slowly you see that actually they've extended the video time to 3 minutes and it's more in depth. And I remember when they launched themselves as an educational platform, and I slightly scoffed at the idea that I would ever learn anything, but scrolling through your TikTok feed, you can learn so much. And I think, I mean, Corin mentioned at the start how popular it has been amongst healthcare professionals, especially in topics like mental health. Breaking down stigma around things like ADHD has been hugely successful on that platform. And also educating people on the symptoms. Mental health is such a complex topic that it actually does lend itself to the kind of interaction that TikTok offers. And to that point, I see that's where the trend is going. It's authentic, it's down the lens, it's not flashy, it's not overly produced. The best TikTok content is the stuff where it's almost like an honest face-to-face conversation. And the best brand performance I've seen on that platform is where they've not tried to inject their own brand guidelines, which is an agency struggle, when they've actually gone, okay, this is how TikTokers like the content. And I think that move to native clothing of content is going to be kind of a strong theme. But I mean, my favorite TikToker in the healthcare space is Tales from the ER. I think you can see in his comments from his followers, so many doctors tagging, saying, this is my experience, this is what my life is. And it's a safe space for them to like joke and share and build. And it's as I say, it's not the Gen Z playground that we all perhaps thought it was at the start of the pandemic. It's definitely grown and changed, and it's engaging way of kind of drawing people in has got a lot more potential to come.
Definitely. And I think Ishtar has backed up by that point by saying one of her favorite TikTokers is a CNN news host, which sounds awesome, and I will definitely be looking them up. But do you think so this pretty stratospheric rise of TikTok, as you said, Charlotte, is obviously pulling in new audiences in terms of the millennial generation. What kind of impact do you think that will have on the other channels? I'm immediately thinking such as Instagram. Do you think they will struggle to keep up their usership?
I think everyone's been watching Instagram become the testing ground for Facebook's new features for a while, and it's not always had the great success. I mean, IGTV is not what they wanted it to be.
Yep.
But Reels definitely is a way of drawing people in, and they're cloning for success. And I don't think that will necessarily hamper their engagement figures from people watching that video content. Video is proving still to be the key driver of content across platforms. What they have lost, and what is interesting to see, is that the original Instagram that was about photographers and content creators sharing nice imagery, there's been a host of copycat platforms now creeping up to try and take that place, to try and build a space for imagery, static imagery. So I think what's most interesting is the trend of the format splitting apart, and Instagram is slightly bowing down to short form video. And will it ever kind of be able to compete with TikTok on the short form and YouTube on the long form? We'll see. But I'm personally much more invested in the TikTok scroll than the Instagram Reels scroll. That's just a sample of one.
Fantastic, thank you. And Corin, what do you think the landscape will look like 12 months from now?
So, I mean, we've been talking about TikTok, and I think that's the more fun side of things. And but I also think there's the platforms where HCPs can have a peer-to-peer conversation. Because they haven't been able to in the last 18 months. So I also think things like Sermo, or the secure environments where they can talk business to business, or propagate the medical information to each other and discuss that. I think that's going to be a big growth area, because there's very few places where they can go and actually talk in a secure environment and have that conversation. So they're getting used to doing and sharing this content and getting on digital and everything, but I think to actually have the proper meaty conversations that they need to, I think that's going to be a big growth area too, and where they can do that, the big peer-to-peer stuff, as opposed to the more fun or HCP to patient conversations.
Fantastic. And do you think the Sermo-esque platforms are set up or equipped for pharma companies to potentially have an opportunity there, or do you feel they will remain at the level as they are in terms of that HCP to HCP interaction?
Oh, the $6 million question. How much do they want the commercial messaging? I think it's how it's framed is the big thing. It's how, if it's just going to be a false message, then not really. It's when it can be that the trigger of conversation and filling an information space. I think that's when it's going to be valuable for them to be part of the conversation. But when it's just the push of information, probably not. And we've seen that, on other platforms too. No one likes that push of information where it's forced. It needs to be, like Charlotte said, it's got to be that authentic, helpful conversation that people really engage with. And it's the same goes for platforms like Sermo, I think.
Thank you. And finally, Tom, same question to you. What are your predictions for the shifts in the digital world?
Yeah, so I think, almost similarly to what we were kind of talking about around telehealth, I think the older generations will tend to stick with the existing forums that they use. And, fundamentally, I think people need that network of support. And part of one of the big shifts in how intergenerationally people deal with their illnesses and stuff like that is that the younger generations are far more open to talk about it online without the need for anonymization that you get on something like a forum. So, the big shift around conversations around mental illness and mental health, that started as a young person or a millennial conversation, and is now something, people are very open about discussing online, not even in the setting of say a healthcare specific conversation. They'll just quite openly tweet or Instagram post or something about how they're not feeling good at that time, whatever it might be. But as I say, it seems that the generations that precede the millennial groups tend to enjoy that sense of privacy around their healthcare a bit more. So I think for older peoples, and I suppose typically speaking, older peoples will have more health problems, that you'll have a lot of more of those conversations taking place in those anonymized platforms. But the younger peoples will be much more open to talking about this on, say, TikTok, and they'll talk about, maybe they have psoriasis, and they'll talk about how they deal with their psoriasis to show other people how they might want to deal with it, and also other people not to be ashamed of having it, to show that it's something that people have. It's an open and it's an open illness, and that it's just something people live with. In terms of the doctors and doctors and HCPs, again, I think the big part of how their conversations are going to shift is it's going to be heavily influenced by social metrics and the success of those social metrics. Kind of going to that point I made before, these are people who are talking on social sites which require positive social metrics for them to keep up their influence, to keep up their name, their brand online, and they're not doing it. I think partly they're doing it out of some altruism to help people, but another part of it is that they are looking to get that success, and in order to achieve that success, they need to keep up to date with the interests and whims of the audience they're trying to speak to. So it's certainly the HCP conversation. Sorry, as I said before, I think it's going to be very heavily influenced by the generic trends that are taking place within the younger generations.
Thank you. So I think over the last 45 minutes or so, what we've talked about so much is how increased literacy and authenticity have really been at the helm of kind of spearheading the changes that we're seeing for patients and for HCPs as well. So my last couple of questions before I hand over to the floor for questions to be submitted to our panel is thinking about the audience on the line today. The majority of us, I think, are based in agency. I think we have a couple of people in-house as well, but we are coming at this from the perspective of comms practitioners, very often working with pharmaceutical companies. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions, and we'll start with Corin, if that's okay, on how pharma companies and agencies can adapt to the changes that we are seeing to produce really impactful but also value-driven work for the communities that we work with.
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, the momentum that we've got at the moment with everything going so digital because of the pandemic, I think has been great. And to maintain that momentum is really important. But also the making sure that we do that research beforehand. There's a lot of people out there who are engaging in content, but we need to make sure we're building the right pieces for them. So yeah, we can, I think, whenever all of the things I've done before has always been that research piece before, speak to people that we're creating the content for to make sure it's right. There's no point in jumping on a bandwagon of a new piece of technology that could end up like House Party, it's gone within 6 months. It may look right at the time, but if it's not right for the user, then yeah, just make sure you do that check beforehand with the people that you're going to be trying to build the content for.
Mm-hmm. And I guess thinking about those checks, I mean, a lot of us will work with qualitative advisory boards, which I know are a great ground for that. But Tom, when we're thinking about doing that groundwork from an analytics perspective, what should we be looking out for?
I think keeping tabs on influential individuals, generally speaking, is a good idea. They tend to set the narratives which get picked up by people. So if you're keeping an eye on what people are talking about in those spaces already, you'll have a very good ear to the ground in terms of, what is already popular with these people, what is already working well with these people, and how can you kind of sit in an authentic space within them. And also, the influencers themselves will have very niche audiences whom you might be trying to reach, and understanding the audiences they reach will also be a very useful step in terms of the development and the insights around content that you're developing.
Thank you. And then back to the original question of how can we as agencies working with pharmaceutical companies best keep up with what we are seeing in the digital world?
Yeah, again, so in terms of on social, how do you predict and identify trends without having an understanding of what those trends are before is a very complicated question, right? Because you almost have to apply a lens of knowledge to know what you're looking for in order to identify things. So again, going with that methodology of saying, well, we know that these people have some influence or control over a narrative that's taking place and have maybe a better ear to the ground than we do in terms of the people they're influencing and what the people they're influencing want to see, using them as, I suppose, a lighthouse or some kind of a a North Star of direction that you can follow and then continue to build analysis frameworks off the back of around, say they talk about plant-based health and the effect on the gut and mental health, to go back to that example, then you can start to look more deeply into that trend and identifying the broader conversation that's taking place within it, not just the one that's happening within that specific community. And then you can, again, use those insights from that conversation to help develop whatever the campaign is that you're trying to make.
Thank you. And Charlotte, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Corin in terms of don't try and fit something that isn't right for your audience. Stay attuned. The best thing you can do is stay attuned to the needs and habits of your audience. And healthcare doesn't have to march the same beat as FMCG or politics or sport. It's its own piece. And especially as someone who works daily with the social platforms, not all of them are catered to serve our needs directly in terms of what we are trying to achieve in educating and building communities. We aren't trying to sell often in the pharmaceutical world, especially for most of the world. We can't even communicate the products that we are supporting. So I think being shrewd to what is going to add value to your audience when they get that bit of content is kind of key for the kind of coming months, just and always. But just on the point around dead platforms, I would also just say, look out for social audio as a new area, a new trend. I personally am super keen to see where it will go. Obviously, Clubhouse sparked a revolution last year, but it's, I don't know, at least for me, been taken over by crypto people. But Twitter Spaces, Spotify Green Room, Facebook's own social audio platform. One of the kind of takeaways from me personally from the last year is the amount of screen time I had. Social audio is potentially a backlash to this. People don't necessarily want to have to be looking at a screen to receive content. How else can you package up? How else can you deliver that value, that education, that content? Audio is another avenue. But to Corin's point, check your audiences are there, check that it's part of their habits. Don't necessarily go into the space and expect them to come to you in that way. But yeah, that's an interesting one to look forward to in the next couple of months.
Thank you. I think we will all keep that hot tip in mind, particularly. I mean, it's great timing, as I'm sure everybody else is knee deep in their 2022 planning as well. So fantastic. Thank you. At this point, I am going to turn over to questions from the audience. So if anybody has anything that they would like to ask our panel, please pop it in the chat and we can use the remaining time to cover off those questions. I know it can take, so we've got first question from Ishtar, which is a great one. So we have chatted a lot about the opportunities that are going to arise for us as an industry, but what are the watchouts that we should be keeping in mind and advising our clients on?
I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, the kind of key watch out, I think, kind of on a macro level, is that at the start of the pandemic, pharma's reputation, always on the kind of teetering, had a surge and uplift, a positive spike, but we are now seeing this shift backwards. And if you believe recent reports, it's heading towards negative space once again. Key watch out is just thinking about, okay, if your messenger is a pharmaceutical company, what considerations what preconceptions will your audience have, especially as that perception of the industry as a whole is in flux and shifting.
Thank you. And Corin, anything from you?
I think a bit of a watch out, it's this communication piece between the farmers and the agencies almost. You know, we're in digital space now. We can get a lot of tracking, a lot of data from them. a lot of the time it's quite difficult to get that from the pharma company when, you know, we built a site or built a platform for them. Obviously all the tracking is theirs. And often it's from my point of view, especially in digital, is to get that information, get these learnings, the success learnings and metrics from what you've created. So being able to share that with the agency and give them the information that we can then really build and do more successful things with, rather than keeping that in. I think that's a big thing for me to watch out. They're really embracing digital, so they need to embrace sharing the information behind digital as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And Tom, anything from you?
Yeah, Charlotte, I completely agree with what you were saying. It seems that the kind of distrust around healthcare, the healthcare industry, in particular pharma companies, has really exploded over the last maybe 18 months or so, kind of since the vaccines really started to become widespread and mainstream. And the distrust of it comes really from a basis of a distrust, generally speaking, in capitalism. And one of the big narrative ideas that they have in this conversation is a patient cured is a customer lost. So keeping an eye on these types of ideas and what people are saying and justifications for saying this, even if it is just essentially a slogan, is a very important consideration in the development of content. You know, watching out for the pitfalls and the landmines that might lend someone in that community to start calling out, you know, evidence of narratives they've been creating over the last couple of months is definitely a pitfall you need to be careful of.
And the next question that we have is around, and I think, Charlotte, you alluded to some of these a little bit earlier on, but the restrictions that the platforms are bringing in, and the fact that it does mean that our campaigns are having to meet more and more requirements. There's an example given here that Twitter was halting some campaigns as they thought they were potentially promotional, even though the content itself was purely unbranded. So question to all panelists, how can we work with and get ahead of the restrictions that we see coming in? And do you have any advice for navigating those that are already in place?
I mean, the best thing is to refresh and stay close to the updated guidance and guidelines as much as possible, but equally stay close to the platforms and feel free to challenge, because there has been the knee-jerk reaction of more content moderation in some cases, and it's interesting how certain posts get flagged up more than others. If a campaign is halted, that might be that it has a keyword that has particularly triggered it, and actually the full context of it is fine. There might be a host of reasons why a Twitter campaign, for example, is halted in terms of its promotion. Staying close to the reps and avoiding kind of key kind of limitations that they put in, and that is in terms of a personal attribution. As much as we want to be connecting directly with our audience, the platforms don't want us to be saying, hey, you with cancer. So it's really about walking the fine line that they allow us to do, but also being responsive and knowing that they are flawed. As much as I'm a social advocate, they are flawed systems, flawed platforms, and things can get snagged that don't necessarily need you to go and rewrite all your post copy. It can just be a system error. So keep calm is also the first thing.
Fantastic, thank you. And the next question, which I'm going to pass to Corin, could you talk a little bit about a campaign that you believe is truly innovative or impactful that you've seen over the last couple of years, one that you really, really love?
Narrow it down. So there's two. Firstly, there was it's a breast cancer campaign that we did at my previous agency, and the way that we spent a lot of time working with women who had secondary breast cancer and getting the content right. And it ended up being just a nice little story of, you know, learning how to know that there's more choices out there than just chemo. So actually having something that was worked so closely with these people to say, yeah, this is something that I recognize, or that isn't preachy. I think that's it was really lovely to see the video that came out in the end, because it was not only a lovely video, but we knew that it hit the note tonally. And the other one was, it was a while ago, and it was a campaign on BuzzFeed, and it was for the Alzheimer's Society. And it was back when BuzzFeed was, the place for top 10s and lists and everything. And it was the most difficult quiz you're ever going to do. And it was to talk to the target audience of BuzzFeed and let them understand a bit about Alzheimer's. And it had 9 questions. The first 4 had an answer. They were all multiple choice. And the first 5 had an answer, and the second 4 had no correct answer. And the comments underneath of the frustration of going, oh, I'm sure I've got this right. And then you suddenly saw them go, oh, actually, now I get it. To have that, the penny drop moment, and to see something like that happen where you're like, these comments were gold. And it just hit so well that people just went, oh, now, it was, those are two really nice ones that you just knew the audience had got it.
And I think what's so smart about that BuzzFeed campaign is you have the initial content from that quiz and people doing the quiz, but then you also get that second tranche, which articulates the point so brilliantly, where you can post and make a conversation about the reactions themselves. And I think something that I always think is so smart is where you see campaigns which evolve very naturally, rather than you can almost see the team going, right, we've done phase 1, now we're on to phase 2. The conversation takes on its own steam. Fantastic. So we have another question here, which I'm really keen to hear from actually Corin, as you're still large on my screen. Let's start with you, and then we can hand to Charlotte. Apart from compliance rules, do you have any boundaries for healthcare and pharma brands' presence on social emerging channels like TikTok? Anything that you see and think, yes, that's smart, or alternatively feels like it's slightly missed the mark?
A good one. To be honest, for things like TikTok, I haven't really seen some as many as I'd like. And I think it's because with a lot of the times when I've been talking to people, even using things like Clubhouse, it's they don't want to do it until they've seen someone else do it. So there's a reticence there already. With so many things, unless one company's dipped their toe in, then people and there's got a good reaction to it, then they're not even going to think about it. And I'm thinking at the moment, some are still a little bit early for that, to have some big campaigns. There's been some smaller ones, I'm sure, but to have a really big pharma based one, I'm not sure I've seen a great one yet. But I think that this is our job to work with them and say, okay, now's the time, dip your toe, and we can help you come up with something which is really sort of fun and engaging and ticks lots of boxes.
Thank you. And then we've had a related, I would say, question, which I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, around, do you see any companies trying to be present on all channels for all audiences without necessarily thinking about the appropriateness of the platform, or whether they've got the news flow and the conversation to back it up? And how do you typically see that playing out? Without naming any names, can you give any examples of where that's not worked brilliantly, or actually, I guess alternatively, you've seen opportunities of companies really building a very valuable conversation?
For sure, there are plenty of companies who will stick their logo onto an account, claim that username, and then let it sit dormant, and you wonder what the point of it is. I haven't seen, as Corin said, I haven't seen too many people wander into the TikTok space. I think there is a reticence, a kind of concern that it is this new Wild West, but in terms of overcoming that boundary, we just need to keep on reassuring that the MLR team, that in terms of pharmacovigilance and adverse event reporting, same mechanisms can be put into place. But in terms of good examples of brands using the multiple channels to tell a story where they're not thinking, I'm going to get the most out of this one piece of content by posting it on my Facebook and my Instagram and my Twitter and my YouTube. Headspace is a really good example of a healthcare brand that have really curated the content per platform. They thought about the experience natively of the user in those different platforms, whether it's on Instagram or whether it's being served an ad on YouTube. They thought about the mindset and the different habits. And as a result, they've grown so well that their brand is so strong. And it's not a coincidence that these really powerful brands that we all kind of know and love have a more sophisticated approach to their social content. They treat their platforms in a way where they kind of appreciate the strengths and also limitations of each of them, because you can't do everything on Instagram, you can't do everything on TikTok, you can't do everything on Twitter, but you can do different things, and thinking about what your audience is doing and what your audience needs first and foremost is what makes Headspace so successful, I think.
Thank you. I obviously am very familiar with Headspace, but I hadn't seen any of their social content, so I will definitely be looking that up. That sounds great. Thank you. It's great to have that very tangible example where people can go away and actually look on the different platforms and see how they've applied those learnings. Fantastic. Brilliant. I am just looking. I don't think we've had any other questions through. So just while we give a final kind of moment to see if anybody does have anything else, panelists, is there anything that you would like to cover off that you don't think we've already discussed around this very broad topic? Or indeed, if you have any questions for each other as well, I would love to hear those.
I have a question for Tom, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Please.
Tom, the main challenge I feel with social listening is the APIs of the platforms and helping brands, pharma companies understand the limitations, the restrictions of the walls that pharma companies place around them. How do you advise people to navigate what is ultimately quite a complex picture? People will be like, how many people are talking about X? And I feel as an agency person, we are never able to quite say, this is the number, no other caveats. How do you approach those kind of conversations?
Well, I mean, in terms of the API question, there's a number of different APIs you can access. So for Twitter, for example, there's two specific APIs which most social listening sites will access, and they'll probably access one of the two. So the first one is the HAVAS, which is a 10% sampling of Twitter data, and it provides you with some of the original content, but really it's just using that 10% sample size to extrapolate out and give you the raw figures, but obviously it's based on a projection. The other side of what you can use is called the full fire hose. This is the one we use, which is all associated metadata, and you're buying the data not in the form of a spreadsheet, but in the form of a graph, which is the native format, which is how you can do network analysis on how people are interacting with one another, how people follow one another, and what things are, like topics and keywords are interconnected with one another. So in that regard, with social sites like Twitter, with forums, news, reviews, blogs, kind of all the generic digital sites with Reddit, the quantitative measurement, I would see is being very accurate in terms of what you're pulling. Obviously, there are restrictions around Facebook from the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2017, I think it was 2018. They still have quite a closed off API. So obviously Facebook, all you're tracking is public pages, and with Instagram, all you can track are hashtags in real time. So, trying to do pharmaceutical listening on Instagram is slightly more difficult, but certainly you're aware of what the community are talking about. The content on Instagram is actually very rich and it's also very visual. So, so it's very helpful to understanding someone's day-to-day life, or actually what their condition looks like, whatever it might be. They're quite open with that. But no, in those platforms, obviously the main restriction you'll have is how do you structure a search in order to capture the full breadth of the content. And in that regard, really, it's just having an ear to the ground with who your audience is and how they talk about these types of things. But I would say in terms of the most insightful stuff, the quantitative analysis is not always that useful in the pharma space. And really, you only need 100 to 200 posts in healthcare or pharma to get a very good insight into how people are interacting and what people's genuine experience is. It's not like FMCG or gaming or media and entertainment. You don't need a huge breadth of social posts to draw specific insights. You just need to have very clear and accurate examples of people's experience.
Thank you, Tom. We've just had a request through. Would you mind repeating the names of the listening tools that you mentioned for usage on Twitter?
Yeah, absolutely. So those are the APIs. The first one's called the Decahose. So it's DECAHOSE, and that's when you're putting a 10% sample. The second one is called the full Firehose API, which is when you're pulling the entirety of the data source. But those aren't specific listening tools. Those are just the APIs being used by listening tools like ourselves to pull data from the native sites.
Thank you. Brilliant. Well, on that note, I will say thank you so much to our panel. This has been such a brilliant discussion. I am personally going away to scribble down all the brilliant things that have been discussed, and will definitely be keeping them in mind for future work. So thank you to all of you for really insightful discussion. And thank you also everybody for attending this session as well. I hope you found it as interesting and useful as I did. Ishtar mentioned this at the beginning of the session, but I know we had a couple of people coming in a little bit later from other meetings. We were due to have our second session tomorrow, all around reimagining health policy in a post-COVID-19 world. Due to some last-minute speaker needs, this has been shifted to next Wednesday, the 29th. However, on Thursday, we have a fantastic session called Post-Pandemic Opportunities in Healthcare Communications in 2021 and Beyond. So taking much of the conversation that we've had today and looking at it from an integrated lens. So that will also be at 12:30. If you've registered, you will of course receive the Zoom links for that as well. We have a hashtag PRCA Health Conf. So please do tweet about today's discussions, and we look forward to seeing everybody on Thursday. But thank you so much for attending, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.